Hi, Gary. It is wonderful to
Gwendolyn?
see you. Hi.
I I don't see you though.
You don't see me.
No,
Do you see me now?
no. What am I not clicking on that I should be clicking on?
So, on the top right hand corner, you might have a little disc that says speaker view or gallery view.
No, I just have the blank page saying Zoom. Um,
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just going to check in with the good folks at the
okay,
page to make sure that I can be
because at
seen.
one point the screen just went white.
Ooh.
Well, it's not white; it says Zoom on it. But and for a second, I obviously I clicked on something that allowed me to get audio, but not the video.
Would you like to try clicking speaker view or gallery view to see if that changes anything?
I actually don't have that option on this page. I have support and I have open support chat.
No. Do you have an icon anywhere with a
No,
tiny little blue button on the bottom of your screen that says Zoom US?
on on my computer. Yeah, should it be that? You think?
You want to try clicking on it for a minute?
There it is. You're right. I got it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So do you see me and hear me now?
I see you.
Okay,
I hear you loud and
that
clear.
that's what it was then. Okay, we're perfect. Thanks.
This is a perfect way of starting this conversation. It's like, wow, Gary, we're supposed to actually be together in the same room right now. And we're supposed to be completing the final faculty and student concert that is supposed to be held this evening in Dublin at Dublin's National Concert Hall. And we're supposed to be playing Shostakovich Quintet, and we're supposed to be, all kinds of things. There's supposed to be something like, I don't know, 40 participants mingling around us or more. And we're supposed to be hearing piano and violin, viola all over the place. But, well, it's not too bad to be able to speak to you
And
instead.
oh well, vice versa, Gwendolyn. But this tonight was the Shostakovich Quintet.
Shostakovich Quintet would have been taking
Uh,
place. The faculty, there would have been two concerts actually today.
and would we still have been speaking to each other tonight after a long argument about the tempo of the scherzo?
You see, we don't know these things.
Oh no, we don't.
Well,
It's
hopefully we can do all of this thing in real life next year, and then you get a chance to argue.
including the argument.
Exactly. And perhaps by then we're so savvy we can film the whole thing and put it out on YouTube, and people
That's
can
good.
click it and go, oh, look, at their own peril, of course. It is wonderful to have you with us, and I'm terribly sorry that we can't offer you everything we had wanted to. But in fact, it is wonderful that the National Concert Hall is still supporting the whole project in some way, albeit online. So it's great that you're here and that we have an opportunity to speak. Congratulations to you. You've recently become a grandfather. You were just telling me. It's such an exciting time.
It is great. Of course, I didn't have much to do with that, but I can reap the benefits.
Absolutely. It's wonderful. Now, I've learned that you haven't seen your grandson yet.
His name is Raphael, but we call him Rafa. No, I haven't seen him. He's in Hoboken, New Jersey. He was born in New York University Hospital almost 3 weeks ago.
Wow.
But because of the present times, I'm going to have to wait a little bit.
Sure. I understand that. Well, I'm hoping to see pictures of you and him very soon, and it must be a wonderful time. So you, in this case, are not in America right now. You find yourself in Paris. Is that right?
Still in Paris.
Okay. And how have you been? How have you coped with this time that we find ourselves in? I think that is one of the questions that has been most asked by any of the people we've spoken to in concern to talking with you.
Well, I suppose that, like everybody, I've gone through a certain evolution throughout all this time. If I remember, it seems like ages ago now, but if I remember at the beginning, like many people, I I didn't know how to handle this, and I was feeling disoriented, and also when it came to music, also I have to admit, I don't mind doing so. I think it's important. I think that we actually talk about these things and admit these things, because many of us probably felt alone and wondered if this was a normal reaction. How can one have a normal reaction to something we've never experienced? So I don't know what normal is, but in my case, I didn't feel so motivated to practice. I didn't feel like I really wanted to get up and practice in the morning, that kind of thing. And then I realized fairly soon on that my way was going to be just to take it as it comes, to try to be sensible, to be safe, to heed the warnings, do what was necessary, and give myself also the chance to just get used to something that, in fact, I, like everybody else, have never lived before. And that actually helped when I took the pressure off myself. And then as time went by, I did start to practice, and with a certain purpose. I tried lots of things, learning new pieces. In a lot of cases that didn't work. But in the end, I latched onto certain pieces and old pieces and stuff like that. And I started to practice. So actually, I'm ready to go. And believe it or not, I even have a concert somewhere next week. And there were a number of things that I could have done that involved a lot of taping, recording, and so forth, and things like that. And they involved trips at the time when I didn't think it was that sensible. One of them, actually, as it turns out, the person who replaced me did get sick and everything was canceled, and when everybody was already on the spot. Now, I'm not into the "I told you so" business, and I won't say that. It's just that I didn't have a premonition. I just didn't see myself doing it. As it turns out, it didn't happen, which is sad. I don't wish that on anybody, but at the same time, I just didn't see myself as being part of that. And I think that's probably one of the most important things in this whole time, is just to listen to yourself and do it the way you think you need to. I had an awful lot, like we all did, of people saying, "Why, I don't know why you feel that way," and I don't really understand why you said no to that. And, the same person who asked me that question is the one who told me that it got canceled. So I guess he got his answer. So, I think in these times, we all have to follow our own reason and our own heart, and there is no right or wrong way, and we have to negotiate our way through all of this. I actually made my first trip on Monday. I took a train to Belgium and went to Waterloo, and there were 4 of my students of the class who were present, and with precautions and all the necessary restrictions, gave them 2 days of lessons. And that was a nice thing, I have to say. I have seen very few people throughout this whole time, and it was good to get back to live human contact in a different way, slightly, but not so different, just with a certain precaution. And that was good. I think it was good for them, because they, like I've experienced, this void and the lack of things to look forward to. And so that was a good thing, So basically, it's all a learning experience. That's what this is. It's just all, in a way, learning from scratch and trying to get back to a few things that we know and that we treasure, that we cherish, and as much as that's possible. And that's fine. I think it's just pretty much an experience where I've realized for myself, it's just wake up, see what the day brings, and not to put too much pressure, not to worry too much about, do you think this is going to happen? Do you think that's going to happen? What seemed to, let's say, be possible to happen yesterday is maybe not possible tomorrow. And we don't know, things are in flux, things are changing. So that's been my way. And I'm not saying it's the best way, but that's the way that I function the best in this situation.
Has that affected how you play? It's a very banal question on one
Well, I
hand.
don't know yet. I don't know yet. In terms of practicing at the beginning, yes. Now, not really. Will it affect how I'll be when I'm actually on stage in front of a public? That's a very good question. One I ask myself, and one I don't know the answer yet to. I guess after Tuesday, I'll have a little bit of an idea of what that is. In some ways, I don't think it will change that much because it's still the music and it's still me playing. Um, I don't know why this is a silly story, but I love the story. Near my mother's apartment, she passed away, but she lived on Columbus and um, on the Upper West Side. And there was a famous old pool hall um, called the Amsterdam Billiards Hall or Billiards Club. And we used to go there. I used to go there with my son a lot. And there used to be an old guy there. Everybody knew him. His name was Irving. And he used to be there all the time and he'd be playing. And if you ever were around his pool table, he would be taking shots. He was good, but if he missed a shot, he would say, "That's not me playing." And then he'd make a shot and he'd say, "That's me playing." That was his phrase. So what I wanted to say was, on Tuesday, I'll be playing, but it's still me playing and it's still music. So yeah, people sitting farther apart, wearing masks. Yeah, but that's not new anymore. And it's still me playing. I hope I don't miss too many shots, but.
How would you practice normally? I mean, with or without the current situation we find ourselves in? It's another question that's been posed a lot. How does Gary Hoffman practice?
Nothing brilliant. I mean, I pretty much have a routine, and in a way, I don't like routine, and yet I do it because I guess there's something about it. I just know that's sort of what gets me on track pretty quickly. First of all, I believe very much in warming up, and we all have, uh, let's say, a way to warm up. Um, I, though it's sometimes recommended by some people, it's not the best way to warm up. I do warm up with scales. I don't mind that. I find it very good for my brain. I find it good for my body. I start slowly, of course, and what I do is I either take major or minor keys and do all of them, and I move up by half steps. And I might pick up speed, I might do different bowings. I don't necessarily have a routine that way. And sometimes I'll just play slowly all the scales, all of them. And just for continuity, bow changes, uh, shifting within the tempo, trying to create as much as possible as a seamless quality. Obviously, intonation that goes without saying, but it should be said anyway. Um, After that, I go to all the arpeggios up by half steps. The only interesting thing, perhaps, to some people about arpeggios is that on all the open strings, obviously C, G, D, A, I do the arpeggios all the way up and down one string, simply because that's something that comes up often enough in the literature, being able to play up the arpeggio, the key that the string identifies. So I do that regularly. And then I do double stops, third, sixth, octaves, and tenths with third and fourth finger. And I don't do all keys then. I generally do 3 or 4 keys. Once again, sometimes I mix it up. I'll do sometimes thirds in broken thirds. I'll do octaves in broken thirds. Sometimes jazz scales, because I love jazz. So just stuff to make it a little bit interesting, but mostly never forcing anything, never doing anything for any kind of speed or virtuoso purpose necessarily. Though that could happen if I'm feeling in shape, I might do it. But I do tend to do it slowly because I know that for me, it's very important to warm up, and it's important to let the body warm up and just sort of get used to things. And I find for my head, that sort of gets me on track. So that's how I warm up.
Can I ask you, you mentioned something quite unusual. You talked about jazz scales. What is a jazz scale? And am I right in suggesting that you listen to jazz in your free time?
I do
Um,
listen to jazz, yes. And do you hear me?
I hear you
Linda?
just fine.
Oh, okay. Um, I I do listen to jazz, and when I was at Indiana as a student, and then later as a teacher too, I got to know very well David Baker, who unfortunately passed away. But he was a great man and a great teacher, and also great jazz player. But he had a bad accident, so he couldn't play the trombone anymore. He picked up the cello later in life, and what we did was, I took some jazz courses with him, but we befriended each other. And what happened was we would get together, and he would play for me, and I would give him advice on the cello, and he would give me advice with jazz. And so, of course, in jazz there are many scales that are used that are particularly appropriate and common, let's say, in jazz playing, like whole tone scales, diminished scales. Uh, we have to obviously know the modes, the various modes, and those are often used, especially in the jazz that was made popular, let's say, by people like Miles Davis and so forth, John Coltrane, these modal players, pentatonic scales. So sometimes I mix things up like that and just make it more difficult for myself to play thirds in diminished scales and things like that. It's mostly for the brain rather than the body, but I just find that interesting and also challenging. And as far as jazz goes, it's always been a love of mine. So that's something that, if I suppose that it's been the kind of dream of mine to be able to do that in public. But I don't profess to have the kind of ability and proficiency that I would like to have, or have I really spent the time on to, in fact, do in public. The closest I've gone was playing at a friend's wedding,
That's
and there was a group of guys there, and my friend said, this guy, he plays jazz on the cello. I said, come on. I probably was at the end of the party, so you can imagine what I mean by that. And I played a couple of songs with them, and it wasn't so bad. At least I didn't think so, but I might have had a little bit to drink. So
It's really interesting to hear you speak about jazz because I think I'm not the only one who holds you in great esteem. You're a highly regarded cellist. You frequently make the top five of living cellists who are most applauded. I don't know who makes up these lists, but I see them come by from serious string papers and so on. So they clearly exist, and you're right up there. And one could suggest that a lot of classical musicians can be quite conventional in how they develop their musical sense of style and what they listen to. As a violinist, there's a number of pieces that I could quote just without thinking that have jazz as a direct influence. Ravel, for example, his blues sonata, the second movement, which is a sort of a persiflage on what he thought jazz sounded like. And I discovered jazz quite early on thanks to my father. I've always been enthralled by the vocalists in jazz. And I've noticed that their way of phrasing is not necessarily the same as, for example, an opera singer might phrase. And it has hugely inspired how I approach certain genres, not certain genres, certain time periods in our musical history. I don't know whether that's right or wrong, but when I, with this knowledge of jazz behind me, perform those pieces, it feels different, it sounds different, dare I say, it grooves. Would you say that there's a similarity to that for you in the cello repertoire?
very much so, Gwendolyn. In fact, I would say not only in the works that have a clear identification with jazz, and of course, obviously not in the music we play unless it's transcriptions, but of course for pianists and for orchestral music, obviously Gershwin and Bernstein and so many other things. In Bernstein, actually, there are the three meditations for cello and orchestra, cello and piano, and there are some jazz influenced sections in it, and a lot of other things because it's quite eclectic. But in fact, I would say in all music, because as you mentioned, um, the sense of time, the question of timing, how you play with time. This is something that's very important to jazz and jazz players. And it's something that is not talked so much about in classical music. We're taught to play in time, but jazz players know how to play in time and play behind the beat, and regularly behind the beat. And that would sound strange for a lot of classical players, because for them that would be playing out of time. But these guys are not playing out of time. It's because they have such a well-developed sense of time that they know exactly where the beat is, and they can play with that. And also including in front of the beat, but very often it's behind the beat to make a groove just a little bit deeper, and give a, playing on the back of the beat. And actually playing on the back of the beat is something that we should be able to do in classical music. And that is something that makes a big difference. And very often is a kind of new concept I noticed when I've mentioned it. Maybe here you should think about playing on the back of the beat. Well, some people know what I mean by that, and they've heard that before. But other people think, well, what does that mean, playing in the back of the beat? Well, like in jazz, how jazz players sort of lag behind, but they're not behind. They're not playing behind. They are behind the beat, but they're not lagging behind everybody. Not in the sense that, gee, I'm not keeping up. Whereas in classical music, very often when that happens, that's just wrong. Well, that may be wrong, but in some instances, that's what we want. And even in jazz, I always thought, for those who know the last Beethoven piano sonata, in the second movement, the variations, there's that variation with the piano, and I always thought that's the first jazz music ever written. And even if it's only after the fact that it seems that way to us, there is a real groove in that. And of course, Beethoven wasn't thinking of imitating jazz, because jazz hadn't been invented yet. But it's impossible for me to imagine that he himself didn't see that this was another kind of music, and that it had a different rhythmic quality than anything else in that piece. Call it what you want, but that functions like jazz. It does. And I think one shouldn't make it sound like Louis Armstrong. On the other hand, there is something of that there. And if one takes it in a completely straight-laced way, I think one's missing the point, because there is a certain amount of free grooving, swinging style to that music. I don't think it's meant just way, though it has some good humor to it. So I think those kinds of things are incredibly important and valuable in classical music. That sense, actually very much the sense of time, and how to use time, and what that means to use time, other than, well, I'm using time, I'm playing with the metronome. There's so much more to time with the jazz players than just playing with the metronome, though generally they're better at playing with the metronome than we are.
Well, I wanted to just actually slot in a couple of ideas for you there. So far, if we were to put together everything we've spoken about, the one factor that everything has in common is time.
Yeah.
Whether the Shostakovich argument we unfortunately haven't had yet.
Well, I doubt that we would be arguing about it. It's just,
You're not going to argue. I mean, you're going to walk in the room and I'll just be like, yes, whatever, yes, sure.
it's been so long since I've rehearsed anything. I don't even remember what that's like,
Just give me a hint. Are you going too slow or too fast? Just that I know already, with it. On a serious note, I mean, time is so important. My mom once said something. I wish I could claim it was my own. And she's not a religious woman at all. If anything, she's spiritual. She once said something that, God is time, and I haven't understood that. And she brought that into the context with music. So, for example, you speak about Beethoven. We know that Beethoven had a metronome that was very probably wonky, not very much good to anyone. Czerny then ran after him trying to get those timings in better. Potentially, one could suggest that playing with a metronome is nice, but playing on the first beat is not always helpful. What I've found very helpful are two ideas. One is the idea of stripping something back and removing bar lines, which I think can sometimes help, or even practicing with the metronome but on off beats, or practicing with the metronome in rubato style. Because I think, am I right in saying that that's what you're alluding to when you say that these jazz greats, or even just jazz musicians in general, have a sense of time that classical musicians could benefit a lot from learning
Very
of?
much so. Very much so. And not only the jazz musicians, but also people who play music maybe similar to jazz, but it's not exactly jazz, but people like, I had an experience with Bela Fleck, and he's a great player. And we were playing some classical arrangements, but also some kind of crossover stuff. And playing with him, an old friend of mine, Edgar Meyer, who's both classical and jazz and bluegrass player. These people have a highly developed sense of time, and they're incredibly rigorous about it, and do practice with the metronome, very much so that they understand exact time. And very often that's a recommendation. I mean, we weren't speaking specifically about teaching, but very often I noticed that the issue of taking time, rubato, all those issues, obviously very important. But one thing I think that's incredibly important is to know what exact time is, so that one understands where time should be taken or how rubato should be taken. It's my impression that if one does not have an exact sense of time, then the rubato and the time taking doesn't make so much sense. And it goes back to something that Casals said. It wasn't exactly said in the same way, but there's a sense about it, and it relates. Freedom, yes, but with order. And in other words, the way I take that, many ways to take it, but one important way to take it is, I think, to understand what it would be if it were exactly metronomic. Because very often people think, well, where should I take time? Or what, have you ever tried playing it straight? No. Well, play it straight once. You'll probably know where it should move ahead, where it should hold back. Right now, you're just guessing. Right now, you're just doing basically what you've heard, but you need to have your own reaction to it. And the only way to do that is to play it once absolutely straight. Mm-hmm. And then you'll know where it needs time, pushed, pulled, whatever. So it'll be natural. So I think that's something that I noticed in working with Edgar, working with Bela, that on the contrary, they reinforce their sense of time always. They're practicing that stuff. That's incredibly important.
David Oistrakh had a similar methodical statement about that. He mentioned that with time, you can't be a thief. Whatever you take from one bar, you're going to have to put it back in somewhere else. And I find that idea very interesting because, I mean, he's a man with amazing rubato, and yet he always keeps the sense of pulse. When he
pulse and balance and I mean, music is elastic, but it has to come back. Like a tennis player always has to come back to the middle of the court. Mm-hmm. You take a shot and stay on the right side, the guy's going to nail you on the left side, and that's the end of that point. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a question. I was during this week, the course of this week at the National Concert Hall online, I gave a seminar on vibrato. And I found it very interesting. In an online world, when you're presenting seminars, you're looking more or less into a void. So there's no exchange with people in the room. I mean, that's perhaps the most daunting thing. And it led me to realize that I was kind of like back in, kiddie shoes, trying out something for the first time. A situation I hadn't been in a long time. And there were two things that struck me. The one thing that I'd like to ask you is there a moment when you should, differently. How do you coordinate bow and vibrato? Seeing as my whole seminar was on vibrato. The reason I'm asking you is it's one thing on the violin. It's a different thing on the cello. I'm very interested what your thoughts are on that sort of coordination, left and right hand vis-a-vis vibrating sound.
Are you speaking about the actual physical coordination or how they relate in an expressive way?
It's kind of like both. So in a different way, if I were to ask myself the same question, I would try not to cut the string in the middle of a sort of vibration, whatever that means.
Okay.
So I try not to sort of stop the vibrato by cutting the string, by changing the stroke at a time when I'm sort of still in a nice juicy sort of stewing vibrato series situation.
Well, I guess I haven't gone into that kind of detail myself about it, but I can see the point. I think what I think about is, first of all, just the whole issue of how vibrato, it's not exactly answering your question, but maybe we'll get sort of to an answer. But I think, and this is nothing new, but it seems to me that in terms of the function of the vibrato, it all really comes from what is going on with the bow. And so, therefore, it's important, if one has any question, or if one is unconvinced as to how one is vibrating, or or wonders how one should vibrate, then it would be important to play those notes, or that passage, or that theme non-vibrato, and then to let the ear guide the vibrato into seeking what will complement that. And of course, complementing doesn't necessarily mean doing the same thing that the bow is doing. For example, if one wants this very sort of floating, shimmery sound, that would be accomplished generally by more bow speed and less pressure in the bow, but rather more intensive, probably faster, could be narrower, could be wider. That depends on the character one is looking for, but definitely rather on the intensive side. Whereas physically, one has the impression of doing less with the bow. We can call it less or more. I don't think in those terms. It's not less or more, it's something else. It's more speed, but less pressure. So one is digging in less, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And very often, when one is doing what seems to be something of less active nature with the right arm, the automatic reaction is to do the same with the left hand.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, that's not what we want sometimes, maybe even a lot of the time. Which brings me to the next question. I'm thinking more, rather than thinking of exactly, how that relates in a very, let's say, momentary way, but the independence of arms. The independence of arms. In other words, the idea that, yes, we're symmetrical beings. We like to do the same thing with both arms. That's why many conductors do these kinds of things. They shouldn't, because one hand is absolutely, one arm is useless. You can do so much more with the left, or maybe you do with the right, but most people would do that with the left. There's so many other things you can indicate, but of course, this is just an example that we're symmetrical beings. So we like to do the same thing with both arms, and we should know how to do that and utilize that and benefit from that in important moments. But of course, we also have to be able to be independent. So then, by the same token, vibrato and the bow. So whereas that is, I have a student right now, we're working on that, because he realized that basically he vibrates always the same way. He's a very good cellist. He plays extremely well. But he's noticed that, in fact, the vibrato doesn't really have a function. And that's changing. And he's understanding it. And that's great, because that's what you want. And part of what he's understanding is that you have to do different things sometimes. And then sometimes you have to do the same thing. But there's no rhyme or reason to it. It just depends on this specific instance.
And are you just talking here now technically as in speed, amplitude, so like the speed of the oscillation, the breadth of the amplitude,
And even
according.
the angle and the part of the finger that's touching the string, because many people seem surprised when I've discussed that. You have all of this surface area you can use, but you play almost invariably on the tip. If you
Mhm,
want a thicker sound, let's say, in
mhm.
terms of what the vibrato can do, of course you can do that with the bow to a certain extent, but there is a certain component that the vibrato, and the left hand in general, but the vibrato can in some way amplify or complement or whatever. That also has to do with contacting the string, at least on the cello, because we have thicker strings,
Mm.
with another part of the finger. Generally, towards the tip of the finger will create a more precise attack and a more, let's say, uh, rapid speaking attack. Whereas farther into the first joint, you're going to reach a point on the finger where there's just simply more flesh to deal with. And if you're contacting the string with more flesh, and then even with the same vibrato, obviously the effect on the string will be different than with the tip, and also the angle of the vibrato, because many people somehow develop a vibrato where they're vibrating basically just up and down with the hand perpendicular to the fingerboard. The problem with that is that creates a not very interesting overtone series. If you combine that with a somewhat of a diagonal component, the string starts rotating on the finger rotates on the string, and different points of the finger are constantly being touched, along with speed and amplitude, and combining all of that, and much more interest can be created in the sound. It, if people wonder if that's true, they only have to experiment and hear it. The difference is audible and immediate. And so all of those things, of course, can be done with the left hand. But in the end, much of the time we do, let's say there's a sort of heavy into the string bow approach that maybe one would have this type of what we would consider an appropriate vibrato. But that's not necessarily the case. Very often they go hand in hand, and very often they're actually quite opposite. That's the ear, of course, or the imagination that would dictate to the body that impulse. The body has to know how to deal with that. That's why, and that's something that I also talk about to students, whether they're my own or some that I might see in a class or something. I used to spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours taking single notes and varying all aspects, keeping a constant, the bow in a certain part of the string, speed, pressure, the same. And now on one note, seeing all the different possibilities that can be achieved with the vibrato in terms of amplitude and speed, how you combine that, angle, where on the finger you touch the string and all that. And to hear with the very same bow approach, no difference, how you can change that. And then reverse that. One vibrato, do different things with the bow and hear. So in other words, to hear how the instrument responds, to hear how with different uses of the body, the instrument will respond in different ways. Kind of like learning words and getting them into your vocabulary so you understand. And my feeling is the more one can do those things, the more one can actually play in a really spontaneous, expressive way, because then the ideas come, there's some sense of what that sounds like, and the body understands how to produce that. Of course, it takes practice and it takes time and so forth. But in a way, it's like feeding one's vocabulary with more specific words that pertain to that exact expression. So it's not just all intense expressions are with the same vibrato. And, there's nothing about a vibrato being faster that makes it more intense any more than non-vibrato being not intense. That can be the most intense expression in a certain context, depending on what happened before and what's happening later. So there aren't any rules about these things.
Absolutely. Have you ever used vibrato as a tool to break through misconceptions of tightness in the arm or in the hand?
Very much, because it is a constant motion and it's rotating, and there is a way, especially dealing with tension on stage, let's say performance tension, to be thinking of vibrato actually as an opportunity not to feel physically stuck, and that is definitely helpful. There's no question about it. There are times and certain things, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's great to have an idea of what you want, and even a very exact idea and so forth. But sometimes when you get on stage, of course, if you're feeling nervous, and which is generally the case, and there's stress, which is generally the case, and all that kind of thing, and that will manifest itself in certain ways, psychologically, mentally, and physically. That maybe we have to do certain things to just sort of get into the swing of things, and that might mean digging in a little bit more, maybe vibrating a little bit more, just to sort of get things going. So, you sort of get out of this state that you really don't feel is helping you. So definitely that's very helpful then. I mean, generally speaking, I always feel, however, that vibrato invariably flows from what the I'm basically what the bow is doing, because that's really essentially the greater part of what the character of the sound is. But that's not to take anything away from what the left hand can do. Um, it's just that I noticed that we seem to be in an age where we're extremely left-hand oriented and not so bow oriented.
Really?
That's what I feel.
Oh, no.
You know what I notice, Gwendolyn? Very often. I mean, that's my impression. I notice often in classes when I'm asking somebody, just if you don't mind, just keep an eye on what I'm doing.
Mhm.
The bow.
Mhm.
Okay. And I notice the first thing they do is look at my left hand.
That's interesting.
And then I say, the bow's here.
Oh, yeah,
Oh
yeah.
yeah. And it's interesting. This happens time and time again.
But would you not think that? So, Herman Klebers, who was my first sort of teacher outside of my family, so my mom and dad taught me, and then Herman taught me from the age of 12 till 18. Are you familiar with him, or were you familiar with him?
Well, not personally, but I certainly know who that is, and I've heard him play. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm a huge admirer of Mr. Krevers, not just as a musician, also as a human being. I thought he was one of the most morally, ethically correct teachers I could have hoped for at that age. And he impressed upon me, and I do quote because I remember this, and it was kind of I'm not great at maths, but this one was easy enough to remember. 80% of sound production is right hand or arm, and 20% is left. And I maintain to that day that he must have been right. I think that sound production begins in the right hand and is infused with more character through the left.
Absolutely. I would even go with a higher percentage for the bow. But I do that generally just to impress this on on young players, because of the fact that I've observed that we're so left-hand oriented, you know. So whether it's 80 or 90 or whatever, but definitely the vast majority. And of course, as my younger brother would say, it's not only the bow though. And it's true, it's not only the bow. But it starts there, because really everything that we deal with in terms of music is coming from the right side of the body. That's the music is moving horizontally. The bow is moving horizontally. It's describing grouping. It's describing sound character. It's describing pacing, rhythm. I mean, it's not to say that there isn't some rhythm and that's present and should be felt in the left hand. Of course, obviously. But in terms of the large scale issues, it's coming from the right side. So I would totally agree with Mr. Clevers and Krebers. I mean, sorry, why did I say? But Krebers. And I would even say maybe even a higher percentage than that.
When you've spoken to a couple of things that have been asked, there has been a question on vibrato and tight arm, and there's been a question that had come in regarding projection of sound. So you kind of answered that through your discussion of music flowing through the right way. How do you feel about posture, in as much as when you perform, do you feel that when you're sitting on your sit bones, there's movement? Do you literally move around a certain radius when you're sitting, or do you believe more in a rooted position? Is the movement coming mainly from the upper body? Is it an all body thing? How do you feel about that?
I feel it's an all body thing, but the obvious movement is coming more from the upper body. However, the support and the power and freedom still has to come from the lower body. The thing is, on the cello, I'm not I'm not moving around on the seat at all. However, I'm constantly shifting weight. It may not be evident. Most people say I don't move much at all, or if at all, when I play. But I hope I'm not stiff. I don't mean to be stiff. And I do think there's movement. It's just that for me, I believe in economy of movement. I don't believe in wasted movement. I believe that motion is important, but it should go into what you need. Now, there are times when I do feel, of course, the stress. I feel, gee, I'm feeling a little bit stiff. I'll try to induce movement as a way, to get out of the stiffness, to get out of feeling blocked, because that happens. But I am not one of those players that moves a lot when he plays. However, once I think one has the feeling of shifting weight when it's important to do so, once one has the feeling of the rhythm in the body, it doesn't mean that there's no movement, but there might be so little movement it's even imperceptible to the viewer or the listener.
Mm.
But there is a difference between that and being stiff. It
Mhm.
may not look different
Mhm.
to the lay person, let's say, but it's very different. Unfortunately, I can't demonstrate that right now. And it sounds different too. So it's a question of allowing movement, and for movement to be free.
Mhm.
Free movement doesn't mean lots of movement.
Mhm.
Some of the most tense players that I know are the ones that move the most.
Mhm.
And
Oh,
some of the people that are, let's say, the most fluid in their movements and the most, let's say, at one with the instrument and the music move the least.
mhm.
So it's not a question of, oh, he moves very little, he's stiff. This one moves a lot, he's very free. It appears that way, that the actual truth may not be that.
Thank you, Gary. I'm a little mindful of time, and there's two
Or
questions. One that has just come in that I'd like to ask you, which is, seeing as we've been speaking about jazz, are there any particular jazz musician you would recommend classical musicians to listen to?
Miles Davis, to understand that less can be more. And then my personal favorite of them all is John Coltrane, but not particularly for classical musicians, just because I think he was just, for me, one of the all-time great musicians. Not that Miles Davis was not, but and John Coltrane was somebody who had an unbelievable work ethic. I mean, he had some problems, like many jazz musicians. He, at that time, at least, I'm not sure. I doubt that it's still the same. But at that time, of course, there was a lot of drug usage. And unfortunately, he did get involved with that and then came off it. So that was sad and unfortunate. But he was somebody who had an unbelievable work ethic. I mean, he practiced hours and hours a day. I mean, he was incredibly demanding on himself. David Baker, the person I mentioned earlier, knew John Coltrane. We used to talk about him because he knew I loved Coltrane, and he used to tell me things about Coltrane. And I mean, this guy, there's not a classical musician I know that had more dedication and, just, it kind of incredible practice ethic about what he did. So if anybody thinks, oh yeah, they just, it just comes like that, it's not true at all, actually. On the contrary.
There's nothing random about giant steps in your.
No.
I have another question for you before we slowly wrap up this time that you've generously given to us. And it is one that I'm very interested to hear you speak of. You started off this conversation explaining what kind of a development that you feel you've gone through during this pandemic in which the world finds itself. Um, what do you feel you've missed the most during this time? I mean, yes, playing concerts potentially, but I assume that there's more to it than just getting on a stage and playing. And I'm very interested to know what it is you think that you've missed most.
In terms of musical life, I think these 2 days that I spent at the beginning of this week with my students made me realize even more than I knew consciously that I just missed being around people and having that easy banter and joking around and teasing and having fun and just that. Because uh, though I know other people experienced that too and others did not, but basically I've been alone this whole time. And I'm used to being alone because I'm on the road alone a lot, and I even see sometimes people, but there's a lot of alone time. So I'm used in my adult life, I'm used to solitude. Um, but of course it's never been like this, and many people were thinking, oh, poor Gary. And then I know a lot of people who are having a hard time in relationships and family because it was difficult in the confinement and all this kind of thing. and some of them were thinking, gee, wish I was in your shoes, and that kind of stuff. So a little bit of everything. But I didn't realize so much how much I had become, in a way, maybe in an unhealthy way for me, sort of turned into my life and myself and all that kind of stuff. And I guess I realized in these days at the beginning of the week how much that does make a big difference. Not in really, in incredible ways, just simple ways, because that's the way we are. We're social beings too, and I just having a different perspective on everything you do, because it's not all up here all the time. You're actually living it out in silly ways, nothing significant, but just people getting together and experiencing life again. Life had become complete solitude. So that I realized that I had missed very much, and I miss seeing certain people. I miss going to football games because I'm a huge football fan. And now that it's summer in America, when I go to America, I try to go to baseball. I miss that. But they're on TV, and so I watch. And like a lot of things in this whole time, it's better than nothing. That's the phrase. It's better than nothing. And one day it will come back. And I guess all of that's basically about just being part of something else bigger than just yourself. And that's important. So I've missed that.
Well, those are beautiful words to wrap this up. I mean, part of being something bigger than just ourselves is music in general.
Yeah.
And I can't wait to talk with you, as it were, via our instruments, hopefully next summer when we visit this whole idea in an offline context with students and participants from all over the world, playing for an Irish and international public, as it were, in the National Concert Hall in this beautiful facility that is there for music making in Dublin. And trust me, we can have our banter on Shostakovich, nice and fun and light. I'll very much look forward
We
to.
can even if we agree, we can have an argument anyway, just for the
Yes,
fun of
just
it.
a fake argument, just for the
Yeah,
fun, okay?
yeah.
Gary, it's been a huge pleasure. We will
Like,
see you
but
shortly back online for our final culminating, shall we say, concert, where all faculty will meet and we will have a talk amongst ourselves and perhaps an argument or two, or in any case, some form of chaos will hopefully ensue
good.
shortly.
That
So,
should be fun.
see you again very soon. I'm looking forward.
Okay. See you
Okay,
soon, Gwendolyn.
thank you so
Okay.
much. See
Bye.
you soon. And thanks everyone for tuning in. See you.